Welcome to WikiPodcast. Think for a moment about the invisible threads that connect who we are today to the experiences we had as children. Today, we're diving deep into something incredibly profound and universally relevant: childhood trauma, and how those early experiences can leave a lasting imprint, shaping the adults we become in ways we might not even realize. We've gathered a range of information to explore this, and our goal isn't to overwhelm, but to extract the truly vital insights into how our past can influence our present well-being.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit.
Yeah.
When we talk about childhood trauma, it often boils down to serious adverse childhood experiences. And these aren't just like single events. They can be ongoing situations and take many different forms.
Exactly. Our sources highlight quite a range, don't they? From things like neglect and abandonment, which can be deeply damaging, even if they're less sort of outwardly visible, to the more direct harms of sexual, emotional, and physical abuse. But it also includes things like witnessing abuse directed at a sibling or parent, or even just growing up with a parent who is struggling with significant mental illness. It's a much wider spectrum than some might initially consider.
That's a really crucial point. And while it's essential to understand the potential negative impact, it's equally important to remember that, well, the human spirit is often quite resilient.
Yeah.
Not every child who faces these kinds of adversities will inevitably experience long-term difficulties. That's key.
That's a really important anchor for our discussion, definitely. Now, when we think about how these early experiences stick with us, the sources make it pretty clear this isn't just about emotional scars, right? There are very real consequences for our physical health, too.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is the body's response to chronic stress. You see, early trauma puts the body under a sustained state of alert, increasing something called allostatic load.
Allostatic load.
Think of it like constantly revving your engine. It causes wear and tear over time on your immune system, your nervous system, and your endocrine systems.
Right. Okay. And that constant state of stress, the information suggests, can significantly elevate the risk of some pretty serious health issues later in life.
Absolutely.
We're talking about things like depression, high blood pressure, autoimmune diseases, even lung cancer, and sadly, a higher likelihood of dying prematurely.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the impact on a child's developing brain is also profound. Childhood trauma can make it harder to develop emotional regulation. That's, our ability to manage and navigate our feelings effectively.
Right.
And it can also hinder the development of crucial social skills. This can manifest in children who become withdrawn and anxious, or, on the other hand, display more aggressive behaviors.
And it's not just a general sense of unease, is it? The research points to some quite specific links.
It does.
For example, physical and sexual abuse in childhood have been associated with a higher risk of mood and anxiety disorders in adulthood.
Yeah, that link's strong.
While emotional abuse has been linked more to personality disorders and even schizophrenia later on, those are powerful connections.
And this raises an important point about how we understand the long-term psychological impact.
Yeah.
Our sources suggest that looking at patterns of behavior, whether a child tends to internalize their struggles, becoming withdrawn, or externalize them through acting out, that might actually give us a more insightful understanding of the lasting effects than focusing solely on specific diagnostic labels.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about the underlying ways trauma shapes our responses rather than just like a checklist of potential outcomes.
Exactly.
And on the more severe end of the spectrum, the sources mention an increased vulnerability to psychosis.
Yes, potentially, because that fundamental ability to regulate intense emotions is compromised. There's even research showing a correlation between early trauma and being at a higher risk for psychotic experiences down the line.
Well,
It's also crucial to consider those who are already vulnerable. Children with disabilities, for example, are sadly at a higher risk of experiencing abuse or neglect. And they often face additional barriers when it comes to reporting what's happening and, accessing the necessary support.
absolutely. And the socioeconomic factors, gosh, they create another layer of complexity, don't they?
They really do.
Children growing up in lower-income families often face this compounding effect of trauma due to economic hardship, things like instability in housing and food access, living in environments that might be less safe.
And on top of that,
Yeah, go on.
they often encounter significant barriers to accessing mental health services and trauma-informed care, especially in under-resourced schools. It can become a really unfair cycle.
It really can. So what happens as these children navigate their way into adulthood? those intense emotions that were triggered way back then. The anxiety, worry, shame, guilt, that sense of helplessness or hopelessness, grief, sadness, anger.
Yeah, they don't just vanish, do they?
No, they can persist, often in very profound ways.
And that persistence, according to the information we've looked at, significantly increases the risk of facing various mental health challenges as adults.
Right. We're talking generalized anxiety, clinical depression, an elevated risk of suicide and self-harm, PTSD, problems with substance misuse.
And even difficulties forming and maintaining healthy relationships. It's a really significant burden to carry.
It is. But the impact isn't limited to mental well-being, is it? The physical health consequences for adults who experience childhood trauma are also substantial.
That's right. They face a higher risk of developing conditions like asthma, coronary heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and even strokes.
It seems to all come back to that heightened stress response we talked about earlier,
Exactly. It's as if the body's alarm system is constantly on high alert.
making it difficult to regulate emotions, disrupting sleep patterns, weakening the immune system.
And ultimately increasing susceptibility to a whole range of physical illnesses.
And we also need to consider the societal factors at play here.
Definitely. For instance, women are, unfortunately, more likely to experience sexual abuse. But then boys who experience other forms of trauma might face greater societal pressure, to suppress their emotions and avoid seeking help.
That's a huge barrier.
And LGBTQ+ youth also experience disproportionately high rates of trauma.
And the sources highlight how societal norms in general can discourage expressing emotional distress, which can prevent children from getting the support they desperately need when they need it.
Furthermore, individuals from marginalized racial and ethnic groups often experience unique forms of trauma related to discrimination and systemic inequalities. And this can unfortunately go under-recognized or misdiagnosed within the healthcare system.
Right.
And children who are immigrants may face additional trauma stemming from things like separation, experiences of xenophobia, and just the general stresses of migration.
Now, here's where our understanding takes a really fascinating turn, I think. Our sources dig into the epigenetic impact of childhood trauma.
Ah, yes, epigenetics.
This is the idea that these early experiences can actually leave epigenetic marks on our genes. Think of it like adding chemical tags that influence how our genes behave.
Exactly. What's so compelling about this is that these marks don't alter our fundamental DNA code itself,
Right.
but they can change how our genes are expressed, whether they are more active or less active, essentially switched on or off.
And that can have a ripple effect, influencing fundamental biological processes and ultimately impacting our health outcomes throughout our life.
Precisely. The research even suggests that the way trauma affects the brain, the neuropathology in individuals who experience trauma in childhood might actually be different from those who experience trauma later in life.
That's a really profound distinction. It suggests that early experiences can shape our very biology in unique ways.
It does. And while initial research often focused on the methylation of a specific gene called NR3C1, which is involved in stress response, our sources indicate that this extends to other genes as well, such as one called KATLG. Essentially, significant traumatic stress can lead to long-lasting changes in our neuroendocrine and immune systems.
Which in turn can increase our risk for various physical diseases.
Exactly.
And the implications might even extend beyond our own lives, the idea of transgenerational effects.
Yes, this is a complex but really important area. It suggests that traumatic experiences could potentially influence psychological and even biological characteristics in the next generation.
Wow, so how does that work?
Well, connecting this to the bigger picture, there's evidence linking parental exposure to trauma with a greater risk of PTSD and mood and anxiety disorders in their children.
Even if the children themselves haven't reported experiencing direct trauma.
That's right, even in those cases.
Yeah.
It's almost like the echoes of the past can resonate through families across generations.
That's incredible.
The sources mention animal studies that show stress exposure can cause epigenetic changes that are then passed down. This might offer a biological explanation, or part of one, for this increased vulnerability in offspring.
But it's not solely about genetics passing down, is it?
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Behavioral responses to stress and these epigenetic changes can also be influenced by the environment in the womb, variations in early postnatal care, and other early life experiences.
Which are themselves shaped by the parent's own history of trauma.
Exactly. The sources are careful to point out that epigenetics is just one piece of a very complex puzzle. It involves this intricate interplay between our biology and the environment around us.
Okay.
But the notion that parental trauma can be transmitted through, say, parental distress affecting parenting, the pre- and postnatal environment, and potentially even through epigenetic changes carried in sperm or eggs, well, it's quite remarkable.
It really is. It underscores the long-lasting reach of early adversity.
Absolutely.
Mm.
And this transgenerational impact can manifest in very tangible ways, both in how parents interact with their children through learned behaviors and potentially through these subtle biological changes too.
Okay, so moving beyond the individual and familial level, our sources also examine the significant socioeconomic costs associated with childhood trauma.
Yes, and while it's a difficult figure to pin down precisely, the magnitude is clearly substantial.
Right.
What's striking is that we're looking at both the direct costs, things like medical treatment for injuries from abuse, the expenses of the foster care system, and the indirect costs, which are likely even more significant. These include things like lower levels of academic achievement, increased rates of adult criminality, and the ongoing burden of lifelong mental health problems.
All of which have a considerable impact on society and the economy as a whole.
Definitely. The connection between experiencing maltreatment and struggling in school, which then leads to fewer economic opportunities later in life, is a clear example of those long-term indirect costs.
Yeah.
And the persistent psychological effects undoubtedly contribute to higher healthcare expenditures and even increased mortality rates.
The CDC actually put a number on it, didn't they?
They did. An estimate for the lifetime cost of child maltreatment in the United States was over $124 billion annually when you combine both direct and indirect costs. It's an enormous societal burden.
Wow, that's staggering. And as we've discussed, poverty often amplifies the risk and impact of trauma, creating this vicious cycle of hardship.
Exactly.
But, and this is a really important, but as we touched on at the beginning, the picture isn't entirely bleak.
No, not at all.
Our sources dedicate significant attention to the concept of resilience.
Yes. The fact that many children who are exposed to trauma do not go on to develop negative mental or physical health outcomes.
Right. So how does that work? What are these resilience factors?
Well, they act as protective buffers, essentially. They mitigate the impact of traumatic events and reduce the likelihood of developing mental health problems. The definition provided in the sources is key. Resilience is the process of, capacity for, or outcome of successful adaptation despite challenging or threatening circumstances.
Adaptation despite challenge. Okay.
And it's interesting, positive emotions are highlighted as having a restorative and even preventative effect against negative emotions and the typical reactions to trauma.
So cultivating positivity can be a really powerful tool in navigating adversity.
It seems so. Resilience has been consistently shown to decrease the risk of suicide, depression, anxiety, and a range of other mental health struggles that can be linked to childhood trauma.
And resilient individuals, they tend to maintain their level of functioning even after trauma?
Yes, and they tend to recover more quickly as well.
So what influences resilience? Our sources point to several factors. Socioeconomic status is one. Having access to more resources generally correlates with greater resilience.
That makes sense.
And the nature of the trauma itself matters. More severe or prolonged traumatic experiences can understandably make resilience more challenging.
Right, the dose-response relationship.
Interestingly, though, gender and general cognitive ability do not appear to be significant factors in determining resilience.
That's quite interesting, isn't it? But attachment emerges as a critical factor.
Okay, tell me more.
Secure attachments to at least one caregiver who demonstrates effective coping strategies are highly protective. And it's not just early childhood. Maintaining secure attachments throughout life, including strong peer relationships in adolescence, is a significant predictor of resilience.
So healthy relationships can actively challenge those negative beliefs that might develop after abuse, like others being untrustworthy.
Precisely. They offer a corrective experience.
Yeah.
And personality plays a role as well.
How so?
Traits like low levels of neuroticism and high levels of openness, conscientiousness, and extroversion are associated with greater resilience. It seems certain personality characteristics can act as internal strengths.
That's good to know.
But the really encouraging takeaway here is that resilience is common. It's often a natural part of child development.
Right.
And it can be fostered and strengthened by providing safe, supportive environments and nurturing those secure adult attachments. This underscores the importance of interventions that focus on building strong parent-child bonds.
And it's not like a fixed trait you either have or don't have.
No, not at all. It's vital to remember that resilience isn't fixed. It's an ongoing developmental process that continues throughout our lives, we can build it.
That's really hopeful. So what about the outlook for those who have experienced childhood trauma and what kind of help is available?
Well, our sources emphasize that while trauma affects each child differently, recovery and healing are absolutely possible with the right kinds of interventions and support.
Okay.
And trauma-informed care that recognizes the impact of trauma and tailors treatment to the individual's specific needs and experiences consistently leads to better outcomes than standard, non-trauma-focused approaches.
That makes sense. Treat the root cause.
Exactly. And as we've discussed, providing early and sustained support is really critical for improving long-term well-being.
So what kinds of treatments are we talking about?
There are a variety of options. They range from psychosocial approaches like different forms of therapy and school-based interventions to pharmacologic treatments involving medication.
Okay.
Trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, often called TFCBT, is highlighted as potentially the most effective psychosocial treatment for childhood trauma.
TFCBT.
Yeah, it integrates the principles of CBT with a sensitive understanding of trauma. It helps both children and, when appropriate, their parents to cope with trauma-related symptoms before gradually processing the traumatic experiences in a safe and supportive environment.
Got it. Are there others?
Oh, yes. Other psychosocial treatments mentioned include standard cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, and some more specialized models like real-life heroes, RLH, the Narrative Emotion Process Coding System, NEPCS, and the Attachment, Self-Regulation, and Competency, ARC framework. Even broader school-wide initiatives can have a positive, though often moderate impact.
And medication.
Pharmaceutical treatments like SSRIs and other antidepressants primarily target symptoms associated with PTSD. They may be less effective when used in isolation compared to psychosocial therapies.
Okay.
But they can be a valuable addition, particularly when combined with therapy like CBT. The overarching message, though, is clear. Early intervention is absolutely crucial in mitigating the potential negative health consequences of childhood trauma.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you listening today? Understanding the profound and often invisible ways our earliest experiences can shape us is a powerful first step. It really is. It can open the door to greater self-awareness, compassion for ourselves and others, and ultimately the possibility of healing. The journey from childhood trauma to adulthood is complex and deeply personal, influenced by the nature of those early experiences, our innate resilience, and the support systems we have around us.
It's never simple.
No. Think about the intricate dance between your past and your present self. What resonates with you about how those early chapters might still be echoing in your life today? Thanks for listening. Write us in the comments your opinion on this deep dive and what other topics you would like us to explore in the future. Subscribe to the channel so more listeners can discover these discussions. Thank you, and have an amazing day.